Jennifer, maybe you can tell us how long you've been working on this? Just kind of
Oh,
your process, maybe how you came up with the question, that sort of
yeah,
thing.
for sure. Well, I'm very excited to work in this. I had the chance to work with Jeff in a project about the media between Ecuador and Colombia, and I kind of like it a lot. And of course, I had already experience too when I first got to the US. And because of my accent is different, of course, a lot of people ask me, where are you from, Jennifer? And they were constantly saying like, oh, I watch Narcos. And I was like, excuse me, that's
Oh
the worst
no.
reference that somebody can ever had about Colombia. And I used to get really mad about it, but then I really understood the power that television in general has to shape perspectives. So I really got amazed about all of this stuff. And I've been working in this project for I think that a year and a half. And I just came up with the questions because it's something that is kind of new in Colombia, and we don't really have like a system that can work to help all of these people. And they don't even imagine that we're going to have all of these people coming to Colombia. So it has been really interesting to discover all of these narratives. And that's how I got involved.
All right.
And this really builds on sort of Jennifer's research agenda because she's been working on the project with me since she got to UMass Boston. I guess, was that a year and a half, Jennifer?
Yes.
And
Almost 2 years, actually.
almost 2 years, right? And we've
Yeah,
got
this
an
semester.
article under review at Latin American Research Review on sort of a similar framing that she's doing with her project, but Colombians in Ecuador rather than Venezuelans in Colombia.
Interesting.
Good morning.
Hi, Eben.
How you all doing?
Doing well.
Good.
So we have our committee here. We have an audience. Welcome to everyone who is joining in support and interest. And I imagine there will be people trickling in and out throughout. So I am going to mute everyone for right now. And the process we'll do, Jennifer will present her project for the first 20 or 25 minutes or so, and we'll let you know the good work that she's been doing for her master's thesis. And then we'll open up for questions, both from members of the committee. I'm joined on the call by my colleagues, Dr. Luis Jimenez in the Political Science Department at UMass Boston, and Dr. Eben Weitzman, who's my colleague in the Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance Department, are the other two committee members. I'm the chair of the committee. My name's Jeff Pugh, also a professor in the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance. So after Jennifer's presentation, we'll open for questions either from committee members or from any of you who are on the call. And so the way that will work, you have the ability to raise your hand on Zoom. And there's actually a function somewhere on Zoom in I think the participant list that you can click on a little hand, and that will sort of I'll be able to see that, and we'll be able to unmute you, or you can actually unmute yourself if you don't hear me recognizing you. That way we're not talking over each other, since Zoom doesn't do as well when multiple people are talking. And there'll be a chance for that. Jennifer will have a chance to respond to the questions. And then once we've had some interaction, we will politely invite the audience members to say goodbye. And there will be a closed part of the defense where just the committee members will have a chance to ask questions and give feedback on the written thesis for Jennifer. So that's our plan for the day. And I think with that, I will let Jennifer get started. So Jennifer, if you can share your screen, and we will get started.
Yeah. Okay, can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being present today. I want to start saying that this work was really made with my heart. From my own experience as a migrant, it really helped me to see border conflict with other lenses. And what I'm going to be sharing with you today are the dominant narratives in the migratory discourse of Colombia. This is basically an analysis of the content of the speech in two different populations. The first one, television news, and the second one, the opinion of Colombian citizens. When I first started to work in this paper, I really wanted to explore what kind of dominant narratives are shared in the television in Colombia, of course, and what kind of dominant narratives can be identified in the opinion of Colombian citizens. I wanted to see which characteristics of the dominant narratives can actually contribute to social boundaries, and I wanted to see what kind of similarities and differences can be established between these two kind of dominant narratives. I'm doing this because I truly believe that whenever we use language, we really create reality, significance, identities, relationships, connections. Language in use perform actions in the world. And before I start talking about everything I really did, it will be necessary to contextualize a little bit. So I'm going to start talking about Colombia. Colombia is an undeveloped country that has very little experience as a host country. Historically, has been famous for sending its population to other countries, and this is because we had an internal armed conflict for more than 50 years. Of course, more reasons like social inequality. This is important because by 2012, we have more than 4.7 million of Colombians that were living abroad. And just in 2018, 2 years ago, Colombia reported the largest number of internal displacement in the world. And we're talking about more than 7 million of people. Here's where it's important to mention that in 2016, Colombia ended up the internal armed conflict with a peace agreement. But for some reason, it just keeps happening and people keep moving around. After the peace agreement, people in Colombia had very high expectations, and people that was hurt by the conflict, they really wanted to return to Colombia, but or at least get their lands back, but it just hasn't happened yet. In order to talk about more about the social context, the conditions are getting harder, and for example, in January 2020, the unemployment rate went up, and the statistics are just showing that people, Colombians that are living abroad, they do not have any guarantees for a safety return. To make the situation even more complex, we have the social situation and the wave of Venezuelan migrants, and this is definitely a phenomenon that needs to be addressed and is definitely a challenge for Colombia. As you can see in the map, Colombia shared borders with Venezuela, and in the case of Venezuela, it has not always been like this. Venezuela was hosting a lot of people from Europe in 1940s, people that was trying to escape from the Spanish Civil War. And of course, because of the weather, the geographical location, the natural resources, Venezuela has been actually very attractive for migrants. But over the years, the situation has changed. And Venezuela started to lose its appeal from 1980s because the economic recession. As a consequence, all the Europeans that were living in Venezuela returned to their countries, and we start seeing people leaving Venezuela from this point. If we talk about migration in Venezuela, we need to talk about 3 different waves. The first one starts from 2000 to 2012, and it's a wave that includes people, middle income, professionals, entrepreneurs, students, and it's people that is leaving the country because they want a better quality of life in countries like the US. The second one is from 2012 to 2015, and it's a wave that is including people that is middle class, that is low income people, and they are leaving because they want to avoid the economic crisis, security issues, and political repression that the country is living in that time. The third one from 2015, and is actually the most important one because it's the one that we are experiencing right now, It's a wave that, regardless of social class or educational level, is including pretty much every single person in the country. And here we are talking about people dying of hunger. We are talking about a scarcity of food, medicine, resources, water, absolutely everything that a person really needs to live. The economic crisis in Venezuela is deeply related with the exploitation of oil. Of course, more causes, but the exploitation of oil is the main income in Venezuela. And in 2008, the cost of one single barrel of oil was $130, but it dropped, and in 2016, it was just $26. Today, if we check the price of one single barrel of oil, is $33. And when Chavez was the president, it really worked out. He was using the money that the oil was making for, give access to free education, medicine, healthcare, social programs. But since the oil is not making the same amount of money, well, the government just cannot guarantee all of these services anymore. Also, and very important, Venezuela is importing half of the food. Venezuela is importing half of the food. And this is how we can understand why they're having a scarcity of food, because they don't really invest that much money and time in agriculture. And the consequences of all of this is today we have 5 million of people that have left the country. And in this moment, Venezuela is the country that has generated the largest movement of migrants and refugees in the world after Syria. But if we talk about Syria, Syria is a country that is facing a war. And here is where the stories get together, because Colombia is the first destination for Venezuelan migrants. Colombia is hosting 1.8 migrants right now. In order to build my argument, I divided my literature review in 4 different groups. The first one is the migrant social interactions. And here I'm talking about a person in a vulnerable situation that needs to survive. So definitely needs to eat and sleep, and this is Maslow's theory. After that, in the new host country, the person is going to need to establish relationships. And when a person is leaving a country, it's not just physically the person, it's a person that is living with values, with history, with a background, with dreams, with hope. And all of these set of characteristics are really helping the individual to categorize himself as part of a group. And if we talk about social identity theory, the in-group and the out-group really determine things to the migrant, like access to services. And from the ecological model, we can understand that everything that is happening in the environment can actually affect the individual. The second part of my literature review, I'm talking about the deployment of the migratory discourse. And I talk about how important is the media and the power of the narratives. And I talk about securitization theory, because in Colombia, migration has been addressed as a crisis, and it really allows the government to take extraordinary actions if they can identify something that is dangerous. If an actor is talking all the time and using language of survival, threat, danger related to migration, the speech can actually be connected with acts and in order to protect somebody. And this is exactly what I found in my data. In 2018, Colombia had presidential elections, and the people was very divided. They had to choose between the right-left party or the right party. And then the right-wing party, that is the current president, President Duque, he was using a very famous expression. He was saying all the time, we are not going to become another Venezuela. And this statement is very particular because he was presenting a possibility to become victims of a state if people decided to support the left party. The president was portraying a villain, in this case, Venezuela's government, a victim, all of these migrants, and then, of course, a savior himself, the right party. And this was very obvious in my TV news data. The TV news were definitely portraying migrants in a particular way under specific intentions. This is why narratives have power, and this is why they are important, because they can create realities. Then I talk about contact theory, because from my perspective, contact theory can really help to reduce the stereotypes. Under a safe environment that can create safe interactions, we can really reduce the stereotypes, and this was also proved by my data. Oh, I'm sorry. The last part of my literature review is talking about two different articles. Both articles are talking about the analysis of the speech in different contexts in the media, of course. The first one is talking about the British media, and the second one is talking about Ecuador and Colombian media. The first one is actually the one that I use to analyze my data, is my theoretical framework. And I'm not going to go through every single classification because the chart is already included in my thesis, but I'm going to start talking about how did I classify them and the kind of frames that I found in my research. So I classify my narratives by frames. What is a frame? A frame is a way that the speaker is constructing arguments about different topics, and the author is trying to link the topic with different events to make value judgments. And it's about the impact that it has on society. I found three different frames in my research: victim frames, villain frames, and hero frames. So the first one, victim frames, these are pictures from the original videos, are definitely showing people that is in disadvantaged situations, people that is in need, vulnerability, people that is usually crying, hurt, or sick. And then we have villain frames. There are migrants that are dangerous for different reasons, migrants that are involved in crimes or breaking the law, or just showing how much money it costs for the government to support migrants. Or just, you know, people stealing jobs as a competition frame. And then we have actually the good size, the hero frames, that explains how and shows how migrants can bring economic benefits, create jobs, or just bring cultural benefits to the host country. How did I do all of these? Well, I use a mixed kind of methods. I was using quantitative research and qualitative. For the quantitative part, I explored two different sources of reality: the local television news and the opinion of Colombian citizens. For the quantitative part, I create a database with 80 television videos from Colombia that were talking just about Venezuelan and Colombian migration. And then I was trying to be as much as, include as much detail as I could, and I create this database with the time, channels, number of views, quotes, actors, voices of the migrants, frame classification, subframes, absolutely everything I could include. For the qualitative part, I conducted 20 interviews. The interviews were carried out via Skype with Colombian citizens. They all were adults in a working age, residing in the city of Bogota, and this was my inclusion and exclusion criteria. After that, of course, I typed every single interview. Every interview was about an hour. I type everything down. I create a database to summarize everything. Then I translate everything that I need, and I use other kind of analysis ways like iClouds that I'm going to be talking about that in the future. But why did I pick this specific inclusion criteria? Well, because according to the statistics, the highest number of migrants are adults in a working age between 18 years old to 39 years old. And I just wanted to use the same life cycle. And I picked Bogota because it's the capital of Colombia and because right now it's hosting the highest number of migrants. The results that I found, and answering my first questions, the kind of dominant narratives that I was able to find in television news are victim frames and villain frames. So definitely they are framing migrants as victims and as villains. 48.75% was actually framing them as victims, and 41.25% was framing them as villains. A very short amount as heroes, just 7.5%. This graphic is a little bit more specific and is actually showing something interesting that I found. If you see, every single color has different meanings. The yellow color is representing the victim frames. And talking about the characteristics of the victim frames, I found that some of them are showing humanitarian help, some of them are showing how the migrants are getting integrated in the host country, but then so many, in this case 27 of them, were showing the migrants in a totally different way. Doesn't even fit in the theoretical framework that the British is proposing. And I was like, what is this? And then I found that, as I name it, they are showing migrants as walkers. But what are walkers? Well, walkers are Venezuelan migrants that they do not have any money to afford any kind of transportation, and they have to walk from Venezuela to Colombia 877 kilometers in order to leave the country. And these videos for me were very violent because they don't want to help people, they don't want to integrate people, they just want to show how much they are suffering. So for me, it was just devastating to see stuff like that. And then in the villain frame, we can recognize that migrants are being really associated with security, because they are showing a lot of videos where they are breaking the law, or, you know, having issues with public order or just control, how borders are really full of people. Okay. Another kind of features that I saw in the videos, if you can see the first graphic, the highest number of videos that I found was in 2018. And it really is connected with my literature review, because if you remember, in 2018, Colombia was in a presidential election process. And definitely from securitization theory, the right-wing party was trying to win the elections with this particular framing of victims talking about migration. And as I say, the kind of images that was possible to see were just people crying or suffering mostly all the time. And then we can see that TV news in Colombia are actually including the voice of the migrant. I think that is because most of the videos are talking about walkers and they are testimony videos. So it's good in a way that the migrants have a space to talk about their realities, and it's something that is true, but it's also necessary to recognize that media is framing in the way that they want. It was very different from the British media or the Ecuador media, because in the British media, just 15% was including the voice of the migrant. The rest didn't have any kind of voice. And in Ecuador was a little bit higher, because it was 62.5%, including the voice of the migrant. But it's easy to see that in Colombia, almost 70% of the stories are actually open that space for migrants to talk about it. Then we can see that in Colombia, the television news are naming some kind of a state actor, for example, the government. And 87% of these stories are naming those actors. It really means that state actors are the ones that are building and sharing the stories about migration in the media. Well, my question is, what are all of those organizations that are actually supporting the migration phenomenon in Colombia and are non-state actors? Related to my interviews, it was possible to me to find that definitely the people that I interviewed was framing migrants as victims and villains, but it was amazing to see that they can also talk about migrants as heroes when they have particular experience and close contact with the migrants. And this is definitely contact theory, and it supports my argument that they can really reduce stereotypes with quality of contact. This is one of the iClouds. This was the last part of my analysis after I did all the translation, all the databases, and as big as the word is, it means that people was repeating it the most. What I found in my interviews was that Colombians were very open to the idea of migration. And actually I asked them, if you had the chance to migrate, would you leave the country? And 100% of the population say yes. And they give me reasons why they wanted to leave Colombia. So I start to think like, okay, so if they are open about the idea of migration, so what is really happening here? And they were saying, well, when I go to that country, I need to say that 50% of the population say that they already had experience as migrants. And they were telling me that when they got to this new country, they were feeling hopeful, but lonely, excited, but they were scared, they were depressed, but they have very high expectations too. So these are the words, as you can see in the graphic. Oh, here is necessary to say also that they were telling me all the time that they were open about the idea of migration. But when I talk about Colombia as a host country, they were saying, no, it's totally the opposite. Colombia is not ready for being a host country. Colombia do not have the tools to afford immigration, and it was totally opposite. When I start to realize about this is Colombians are not rejecting the idea of migration, but they really reject the way that the government has been taking actions around the migration phenomenon. So they don't like what they have been doing, helping the migrants. And this is because they consider that for more than 50 years that the war was happening, the government didn't do that much to help Colombians. And now they feel like they are really helping migrants and it's something really new, and they consider that they really deserve the help first. That's why they start to talk about it. When I asked them, what do you think has changed in Colombia specifically, they were saying like, well, we think that mendicity, we have less job opportunities, security, street sales, the amount of people is a lot. And then I started to realize that they have been creating a link between migration and poverty and migration and security. And here at this point, it was the most exciting thing that I found was that I was looking all the time for something related with xenophobia. And I understood that it's not what is happening in Colombia. What is happening, I didn't even know this word exists, but it's something called apurophobia. And it is because they are rejecting the idea of people in extreme need, because they also feel that they need help. So that's something really cool that I found. This one is some examples of the quotes that I found. And if we talk about victims and villain frames, they're talking about a big group. They were all the time talking about a big group. But when they talk about heroes, they were talking on a specific person. So they were saying, for example, if it's a victim frame, they were saying like, we help them all the time with clothes and food. A Venezuelan was asking, oh, this is a terrible story, the one that really touched my heart. And it was a person from Colombia that saw a Venezuelan asking for food. The Venezuelan got a little box and he was happy because he thought it was food. When he opened the box, he realized it was a box full of chicken bones. And this person that was telling me the story saw the migrant crying because, of course, it was just such a big humiliation for him. And then if we talk about villains, we have particular stories about like a Venezuelan tried to rob me. We have less opportunities because Venezuelans are here. Migration has increased crime. But then when I start asking, okay, have you ever had some kind of contact with a migrant? Do you have a story that you can remember with a migrant? I start to hear really cool stuff like, oh yeah, I met a group of very talented Venezuelans who played instruments. My Venezuelan friend taught me about, I have to, I cannot see this quote because of the pictures. He was saying like, you know, he was teaching me about respect and to value the things I have. And then this one was my favorite one because it was a doctor and she was saying, I know a Venezuelan girl, she's a doctor like me. The ways that she treats patients are unique. This is very understanding professional, a very good person. She seems to see her family in each one of the patients, and that is very beautiful. And she ends the quote saying, I think that she represents the majority of Venezuelans. And here we can see that click. We can see that definitely it's possible to see people in other ways when we have a good contact, a quality contact. I got really curious about social identity theory, and I wanted to know the way that Colombians have been building the identity. So I asked them, could you please describe Colombians in general? It was a random question. And they start to say, of course, we are hard workers, creatives, kind, we are resistant, happy people, warriors, such a good stuff about Colombians. And when I asked the same questions, could you please describe a Venezuelan? They start to say, oh, they're criminals, they're cheaters. They are cheaters. They are just really bad people in general. And then, I don't know what's happening. And then we have my conclusions. Definitely the dominant narratives that constitute the migratory discourse in Colombia are mostly framing migrants as victims and villains. Particular experiences were able to help people to frame migrants as heroes from context theory. Constant projection on images of victims for a very long period of time can definitely contribute to social boundaries. This type of projections through the media can develop a sense of competitions for resources and increase stereotypes. The constant projection of images of migrants as villains can contribute to social boundaries. It can create a link that associates an entire group of people as dangerous. And it was possible to find an association between migrants and poverty and migration and security. My recommendations, definitely the promotion of a healthy interaction spaces can promote resolution of border conflicts, creation of a space of opinion that allows the migrant to frame himself in a different way, highlighting his abilities and skills. It can definitely contribute to reduce social boundaries. And from academic fields, it will be really helpful to create good arguments in order to support how much we need to change the immigration law in Colombia. Limitations, I really hope I could interview more people because it was very interesting to hear everything they had to say and why. Thank you so much.
Okay, so everyone's on mute, but I'll say congratulations, Jennifer, for an excellent presentation and for your strong work on this thesis. So at this point, I will open up the floor for anyone who would like to ask a question of Jennifer. You can do that by over in the participant list, there's the ability to raise a hand, or you can alternatively turn on your video and actually raise your hand, or just turn off your mute and ask the question if none of that works. Yeah, there is also a chat down there that you can put text stuff in.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, everybody, for the messages.
Okay, so Denise. Let's see, I think I've unmuted you. Go ahead.
Hey, Jennifer, great job. I really liked your research, and it overlaps in a lot of ways with my own interests too. So you did a really great job. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your process and how you coded the videos you watched, because that is definitely an interesting part of this. But yeah, if you could just say a little bit more.
Well, I had the chance to work with Jeff in a project before this, and we were using the same theoretical framework from the British media. It's basically a framework that is proposing an analysis of the content of the speech in different ways. So if you watch a video, every single video has a message pretty much. So when you identify like the global message, you can actually say, oh, okay, they are showing us this kind of migrant or this kind of migrant. So sometimes it gets confusing, but the process is basically, I was downloading every single video that I could from local television news related to migration of Venezuelans, just randomly finding them on YouTube or the TV news, the local television news. After that, I was looking and watching every single video and identifying the way that they were trying to show the migrant. So it's very easy to see how they are showing them. For example, the victim frames are just literally showing just people suffering, like as the walkers I saw. So basically what I did was like, I pick a video, I watch the video, and I start classify the video in different ways. So I start to divide, like, okay, how are they calling the migrants? As refugees, as Venezuelans, or just like as criminals, for example, that can happen. And then I start taking as much details as I could, the year, how long it is, specific quotes, what kind of frames, what kind of subframes. And it's just like a very long process, but I create a database that literally has the video and then has all the details about the video. And at the end, literally in just one line, I can really see a summary of the video just for looking at the lines. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, so this is the part of the defense that is explicitly for the audience, and we'll have committee questions after this. While we're waiting to see other hands, I see one in the text from Melissa. My question for you, Jennifer, is how this project affected your personal understanding of immigration policy in Colombia and Venezuelan migrants?
My personal understanding is like, I think that Colombia is one of the countries in Latin America that is really helping migrants. They are really opening, they're really open to the idea of help them. But on my perspective, they are the only ones that are seeing this phenomenon as temporarily. And they, for example, don't have any kind of humanitarian visas. Is very different between other countries that they actually have them. In this case, they're giving people from Venezuela temporarily permissions, but that's just not a guarantee that everything is going to be solved in 2 years. So I think that it's very interesting to see how they think that this phenomenon is just going to go away. I think it's not going to go away. From my personal understanding, it's just really obvious to see that immigration law needs to change in Colombia in order to really support migrants.
Great, thank you. Other questions from the peanut gallery? Okay, well, let's open up and see if our committee members have any particular questions during this public part of the defense.
I do have a question that is more, is not a substantive, I'll leave that for later, but just in terms of how you collected the data, because just from what you explained and from what you wrote in your thesis, you basically said that you got it from the internet, but I wonder what kinds of parameters did you use? I mean, like, did you have a time period? Did you just, what did you actually do in terms of, like, did you just put migration, Venezuela, Colombia, or something on YouTube? Or did you follow a particular channel over time and then whatever came up?
What I did was, in the interviews, I asked people, do you follow any kind of TV news in Colombia? They were saying, we don't really trust the media, but we actually watch TV news. So they mentioned 4 different channels, RCN, Caracol Televisión, Noticias Uno, and I'm missing one of them. But these channels were actually named by the people. So what I did was, like, I went through the website of these local television news in Colombia. I typed Venezuelan migration or, you know, kind of keywords. And then it just showed me all the videos that they have in that TV. And some of them were, you know, linked straight to YouTube, or some of them were in the channel. But my first inclusion and exclusion criteria was definitely has to talk just about migrants and migration of Venezuelans living in Colombia. So that was my inclusion and exclusion criteria. And I use and I focus specifically in the channels that the people mentioned in the interviews.
Okay, that's a great clarification, because from your thesis and from what you just described, it sounded a lot more open. But what you're talking about is far more targeted, which is good. Because then I mean, the universe that you used is better than just kind of randomly going on YouTube and, you know.
Yeah, what was kind of randomly was the keywords. So I was just targeting migration and Venezuelans, Colombians, and those were like my keywords that I was using. And every single that was popping in the channels, I was using those videos, and those were the ones that I actually got.
That's not so random, though. I think that's reasonable. So anyway.
So, so I would ask a question, Jennifer. And first of all, I want to say congratulations. This is really a terrific piece of work. Conceptually, it's great. Execution is great. It's well written. Really, really fine piece of work. You should be proud of yourself. We are. So here, one of the things I'd really like to hear you expand on a little bit is in discussing the findings, one of the things that you talked about was how from the interviews, you felt like there were findings that were hopeful for the prospects of contact making a difference. And I would just love to hear you expand a little bit more on what you saw in the data, connections you were able to make, how you understand from your data support for how contact might make a difference.
Okay, so for me, it was very obvious just when I asked the question about personal contact with migrants. In general, they were all the time talking about Venezuelans in a bad way, like, you know, stealing our jobs or mendicity, poverty. It was very bad adjectives around it. And then it was possible for me to see that it really has power in this context when I asked for the specific contact that they have with migrants. And they were saying, oh, yeah, I know a couple of Venezuelans. And they were very specific, telling me stories like, no, once this person really helped me, or once it happens. So it's really connected with contact theory, and I think it really has power because it was pretty much the only way for these people to frame migrants in another way, and in this case as heroes, because they were really good stories that they were actually seeing the migrant from a personal perspective, from a personal connection in a different way. So this is what I really think, that if we promote these kind of interactions, it can actually help them to reduce the stereotypes, because it's very different when you talk in general about the population, when you talk about something that you really know. So that's also part of my recommendations. And I really think also for the media that it is important to create other kind of a space where migrants can be portrayed in a different way. How about, I don't know, like a YouTube channel when migrants can really give their testimonies of like, okay, yeah, I was living such a hard time, but then I have a job, I'm doing all of this stuff, just showing that they can actually empower themselves of their realities and just change this vulnerability situation. It's very different when just one single actor has the power to share one perspective, and where are the other voices? Where is the other part of the story? So that's what I truly believe, that can change and help border conflicts in general.
That's certainly hopeful and helpful. And so, but let me also sort of float an alternative interpretation of what you saw, and tell me whether you think you have reason to believe that it's one interpretation or not the other, or you think it's a question that needs to be explored further with further work. Which is the other potential explanation of what you just described, is that that the general, for the person you're interviewing, the general social category of Venezuelan migrants has all the negative connotations. When you ask me to talk about a specific person I met, I might have a more nuanced, more human, more positive kind of an understanding of that person, but that it's not actually translating to my view of the general category, because I began with this negative, characterization of the broader social category. So there's this question of crossover. It's one of the questions about contact work, is whether the meeting these four people changes my mind about those four people as exceptions, or changes my view about the broader category. So it may be that in the interviews with 20 people, there's not evidence for the transfer,
Yeah,
but I wonder what you saw.
And that's actually part of my limitations, and I put it in the last slide because if I have more time, I really would like to do more interviews about it. I'm just describing what I saw in these 20 interviews, and I think it's really important to recognize that for these people, the only way to frame them in a different way was with personal contact. So I think that is important to mention, because actually, even though it's 20 people, it's important that recognize that these people had the ability to name them in that way, in a different way. And related to the framing, I think it's important and it's very relevant for social identity theory, because they are really creating and building this identity around Colombians. They are Colombians, they feel Colombians, they are in their territory. And that's pretty much why they are saying all of this good stuff about themselves. And of course, they're making this huge distinction between the outside group, in this case, Venezuelans, these people that is coming, that they are new in the country. And of course, if they talk in general, they really are making a difference between these two groups. But yeah, definitely, I would love to make more interviews in a future project or something bigger that I have more time. For sure, it's one of the limitations.
Thank you.
Jennifer, I wondered if you could expand a little bit on the actor analysis that you did. You mentioned very briefly that, you know, the percentage of state actors that you saw represented in the media stories. So on the flip side, in your thesis, you also talk about how prominent or not the non-state actors were. So it would be good to hear that expanded, and also to put you to think a little bit about what that means. So if one of the avenues that you're saying is promising for doing what Evan was describing, shifting from my individual attitude about this person I know to my general attitude about migrants based on that contact, who is best positioned to do that work, right? Is it something that should be the focus of a state policy? I mean, in other states, you've seen sometimes tax incentives or other kinds of policies for, you know, joint businesses between a migrant group and a host person, or, you know, anti-xenophobia campaigns carried out by the government or something like that. Or you can see non-state initiatives organizing advocacy campaigns and stuff. Do you have a sense of sort of how this negotiational frames intersects with the actors who are doing it?
Yeah. I think this is really, really important, because here we are talking who is telling the story, who is really telling the stories. In the videos that I found that 87% of the videos were making a story just talking about state actors. So we are talking about government, we are talking about police, we are talking about immigration in Colombia, and all of these entities that are really managed by the government. So it really means that the ones that are creating all of these stories are the government. And my question, as I say, is what are the other people that is supporting and working really hard for the migration phenomenon in Colombia? All of these organizations, ONGs that really work for it, they are not even present in the media. So what I really think is it is necessary to start a negotiation where all the people that is involved can actually have a space to speak up. Maybe in Colombia, it's not going to be possible through the TV news, but it could be possible in other kind of a space, like social media, like the pages of all of these organizations. But making all of this public can really shape perspectives and frame migrants in another way. So the intersection for me is maybe the channels, the TV news are really showing a message from the state, but different professionals can, in a multidisciplinary level, create spaces to really raise the voice of the migrant in different contexts. And I think this is going to be the way to really start a negotiation when people can really see both sides of the story. Because right now we are pretty much just seeing one part of the story, and it's just going to keep happening if we just keep holding this same narrative. The British media article was saying that if a TV show or if TV news are holding the same kind of victim narratives for a very long time, that's not going to help with empathy. Usually, if you use for a short period of time victim frames, that can actually show empathy with people. But Colombia has been showing victim frames in television news for more than 3 years. Of course, they are sick of seeing these people suffering. And that's exactly what people reflected in the interviews. So I think that that's part of the intersection of all of these narratives and dominant narratives.
That's an important point, and I think it corresponds with, I guess, what my last question was for this component of the presentation. you had this really striking finding that 100% of your interviewees said that they would migrate if, you know, or they had a relatively positive view of the idea of migration. You know, they talked about why and could see themselves in that category. And yet, when you shifted and asked them to just talk about Venezuelan migration into Colombia, there seemed to be just a complete disconnect from those attitudes. It was not the same conversation, it sounded like, and that's why that those two word clouds juxtaposed of self-view of the in-group of Colombians versus the other view of Venezuelans was quite striking, but also about migration and migrants in general. They were very different views. So what kinds of explanations do we find in people's minds? How are they having these be two separate conversations? How are they not sitting in cognitive dissonance to say, yes, we should all migrate and these people should not migrate?
This was actually the most fascinating part of my research, because as I say, I was looking for all of these kind of like xenophobic discourse or stuff like that. And then I found that, wow, no, 100% give me reasons to say like, yeah, I want to migrate. If I have the chance, I will leave. 50% of the population already had experience as migrants in other different countries. And they were saying, first, they are not agree at all, the ones that I interviewed, they are not agree at all with the social conditions in Colombia. So in general, they are not happy with the way that you find a job, with the access to services, talking about medicine, healthcare. They are not agree with, there are a lot of territories in Colombia that are actually dying of hunger and scarcity of food and water, like Chocó. And they just feel like the government has done anything for them in all of this time. And when I start finding this dissonance, it's because they start seeing that the government is actually helping a lot the migrants, which for me is a good thing, of course, because it's something that needs to be addressed. But for them, it's just this idea of fairness, who deserves the help first. Because for them, it's like they have been waiting all of these years, more than 50 years of armed conflict, to actually get something, some kind of help. And they didn't got it. And then this new phenomenon is actually getting a lot of resources, and they are just like, who deserved the idea first? Something else that they were constantly mentioned is Colombia do not have control of the phenomenon. They think, and they were saying this a lot and all the time, Colombia do not have control. Everybody can just enter in Colombia. There are no requirements for migrants. The people that had experience as migrants, when they were trying to leave like to countries like Australia, the US, they were saying, we had to demonstrate so much money to get access to that country. We have to follow so many requirements in order to be migrants for 1 year or 2 years in that country. And what they are finding is like, they think it's super easy to get access as Venezuelans are getting in Colombia. This is not really true. And I think it's because they don't know about the law. I also asked them about, do you know what requirements Venezuelans actually need to get in Colombia? And they were like, no, I don't really know. I don't know anything about it. Just 2 people actually say, yes, I know. And it's because one was a lawyer and she works for ACNUR, for, I forgot the words they were in English. She works for a migration organization, and definitely she knows the law because she's a lawyer in Colombia. And then the other person is a psychologist, and she was actually working, trying to hire people from Venezuela, and all of these people has to follow a lot of requirements in order to get a job in Colombia. So these 2 people knew about the law, but the rest of the people just don't really know anything about the requirements that they need, because it's not that easy. They actually need visas, permissions. And that's also important, and it will be one of my recommendations. People should know more about the kind of requirements that they need, because it's not that easy as they think.
Okay.
Can I say something?
Yeah, go ahead, Luis.
What I wanted to say is actually in this public part, because I guess we're moving to the to the less public part. I just wanted to say actually publicly that I really enjoyed your work. This is exceptional, really. I've seen some PhD defenses that were not as good as this, and I mean that sincerely. So I really liked it. Especially what I liked is the data that you got is actually, I mean, I've seen other people get similar kinds of data, like media kind of stuff, but what you did with it was very good. You got a lot of juice out of it, and I really, really appreciated that. So I learned a lot from this, and I really wanted to say that publicly. So thank you.
Thank you.
Amen.
Yes, indeed. And thank you to all of you who have joined us today. Hopefully this has also been interesting and informative for you both about the topic. I see a number of friends, family, and some of our colleagues within the department who might have future defenses in front of them. So it's always good to sort of see it in action. So thank you for joining. And with that, we will invite everyone other than Jennifer and the committee to say your farewells and log off, and then we'll continue the defense with some more detailed back and forth before finalizing it. So thank you again for joining, everyone, and hope to see you in some future occasion.
Nice to see all those Moya names up there on the screen.
Yes.
I'm glad you were able to join.
They really wanted to see it. Thank you for the messages, everybody. Thank you.